I'm very glad that what I'm going to say doesn't contradict the previous two speakers, which I thought it might do, so I'm really pleased about that. And what I'm going to be talking about is a kind of overview of some of the research I do generally and a kind of positioning of what we do in the school and some of the kind of broad ideas about design research. I'm talking about what I call the political space of design research. So it's not trying to cover all aspects of design research, but those that have a kind of political in the broadest sense aspect to it. Cover it kind of echoing some extent what Murray Fraser mentioned in his presentation, and also Catherine. And so just, I guess this is a definition of what politics means, or what does the political mean, and it's about kind of power, governance, who have some kind of control over others, and some kind of maintaining that power. So it's usually a kind of an elite system with a kind of asymmetry, those at the top and those at the bottom, to some extent. So we're really interested in, or the projects I'm interested in, are ones that kind of explore or critique those kind of existing power structures. It's a very kind of obvious, almost kind of cliched representation of what that might mean. So there's a bank, a kind of closed down bank, somebody homeless lying in front of it, an anarchy sign graffitied on. Clearly a kind of reflection of asymmetries of wealth, the power of wealth of banks, who owns space, who's allowed to control that space, who is that space being taken off, and also who's outside of that system, who's not benefiting from that system. But equally, the kind of politics could be applied to gender, age, ethnicity, class, not to mention kind of ecology and the environment. Nature's kind of missing from this scene as well. Evident in here is there has been a design process gone through to create this system, to create this kind of built environment, this kind of social status as well, which is, has got a distinct kind of hierarchy and asymmetry to that. This image, this photo of the hand down is quite a famous one. And it's here kind of to represent maybe kind of mainstream architecture or mainstream design processes. So one person, usually a man, as the kind of main designer, the kind of controller of what the design will be. In this instance, a whole city being created by a kind of one single kind of central designer. And this image also represents probably kind of from the although it's previous from that, the kind of notion of 1960s town planning gone mad. So the creation of cities and towns and places to live, which didn't quite work how they were expected to, anticipated to. So through that, a kind of lack of trust in the kind of professions of town planning, of social services. So when knowledge is held by a very few and practiced by a very few, then there's a chance that and through lived experience, that it doesn't always work. So it's kind of a critique of both the production of space through the mainstream design process, and also the production of knowledge through a kind of limited research kind of resource and data gathering. And design research kind of critically examines both of these by kind of aligning design and research. It necessarily, or inadvertently sometimes, critiques what design is, or what it often is, and also what research is. Who produces knowledge, why is it produced, and who is that kind of owned by. I'm particularly interested in collective consumption. This is a term Manuel Castells mentioned in terms of even in a capitalist society, some things we still kind of collectively consume, so kind of roads or services, education systems, and it's particularly kind of the notion of maybe public space, as we might call it, so the space between buildings, the kind of, even though those have been maybe privatized, there's kind of issues with those, there's still some kind of notion of collective, really. I'm really interested in how the design research kind of explores or interrogates or is implicated in kind of notions of collectivity. And we'll break it down a little bit, looking at both notions of collective design and then kind of collective research and what that might mean. It's probably important to point out that although I'm using the term design research, although some of the examples I give, the people themselves might not refer to themselves as using design research. and they might even reject being referred to as design researchers, but I'm kind of imposing that on. Probably a little bit akin to Jesus Christ is often called the Son of God, but he didn't agree with that himself. So I'm applying a terminology on that some of these people won't agree with, perhaps. And the kind of practices, I guess, that are of interest or relevance here are where there's a move away from a single designer to multiple designers, or a broader and wider kind of collective of people involved in the design process. There's lots of terms for that: tactical urbanism, guerrilla urbanism, ad hoc urbanism. There's a kind of proliferation of terms. They're not all synonymous, but they kind of share a kind of overlapping series of interests or agendas or methods or practices. And there's a kind of rejection, in either explicit or inherent in the process, of kind of a top-down processes, mainstream, hierarchical, and within that, a critique of kind of capitalism, the buildings that are normally produced, towards a more democratic, bottom-up process. And within it, this is an image from a project in Paris that Doina Petrescu with AAA worked on, which is ongoing. And in it, it's almost like a big experiment, a kind of an outdoors laboratory that's both a social experiment, a material experiment, an ecological experiment, which is kind of ongoing. It's unknown, and everybody involved in that, not just the humans, but the kind of non-human actors in there, are all part of this experiment in terms of design, as it were. Some of the themes tend to be more about definitely working as a collective and more participatory. Testing those in kind of temporary or transient projects or outcomes, or ongoing or non-fixed, etc. At the top here, or it's probably evident in those top images, is the role of the people taking part of those, who make those spaces come alive, who at different levels of engagement either create the spaces or inhabit those spaces, all become kind of part of the designers. For some like Teddy Cruz, architecture is created or can be measured by the kind of intensity of social interaction rather than some kind of neutral aesthetic qualities, perhaps. I guess at the extreme, it's the notion that sort of anybody can become a designer or does become an designer, or in fact, everyone is a designer just through the lived experiences. All of us, or everybody engaged in the built environment, becomes a designer at some extent, to some kind of degree. This is an image of a beach, happens to be in Palestine, just coincidentally with Tamara Fraser's interest. And the beach is quite an amazing space in terms of it can be built and rebuilt every day. The sea comes and kind of cleans it, a kind of tabula rasa. But people can, it's one of the few places in cities or left on the planet where you can just go and dig a hole and modify spaces without anybody kind of controlling it. The space between low tide and high tide, again, is one of the last few places kind of almost globally that nobody kind of can take ownership of. And here we can see people taking, in a very kind of obvious way, taking control of their environment, designing it to some extent, not with a piece of paper, not with a pen, not with a kind of maybe a careful design process, but some kind of process of design can be detected in there. And this notion, it can be applied to the informal cities being built. So globally, 1 million people every week are moving to informal cities, and they're being designed, they're being built, they're being inhabited and lived in. That's kind of one of the kind of biggest experiments in history, almost, in terms of how we design cities and places to live. Something it kind of echoes to some extent. Joseph Beuys, who was an artist, a German artist, back in the 60s, maybe 70s. His notion was that everyone is an artist. So, I mean, by that I meant everyone's a kind of creative human being. And that creation doesn't matter whether they're an artist or a physicist or an engineer. The process of creation and design is kind of inherent in every person. So move to knowledge, so kind of the research part of design research. This is a drawing from how I like to do my lectures normally. Ideally, students kneeling in front in a kind of more prone religious position, but more relaxed. You can sit on your chairs today. Looking back, you can see kind of discipline and power are very important in education and control. And so for the notion that kind of knowledge is neutral, Freire here mentioned that there's it's impossible to have a neutral education. It's non-neutral, so it has some kind of political agenda to it. Usually, not always, but usually reflecting the kind of mainstream or the elite or those in power, I guess, partly as a method of reproduction as well. We can see in the news at the moment is, in a very kind of small way, Michael Gove redesigning education back to a kind of Victorian model of learning by rote and having a kind of test exam. My kids are in school and the whole curriculum is being transformed. So history lessons are now just about kings and queens of England and maybe places we colonised over the last few hundred years. And there's also a kind of politicisation of kind of climate change, which is very kind of topical at the moment with Donald Trump, a kind of right way about possibly taking over America. But there's more kind of nuanced or softer or more kind of hidden versions of kind of politicisation of knowledge. Who funds what, why is it funded, and for what purpose? In the UK, the STEM projects are really important: science, technology, engineering, because it's manufacture, pro-production. But one of the maybe kind of criticisms is, again, it's just the cost of these. So Bruno Latour points out that there's a kind of limit to what we can possibly build and find out. So the CERN laboratory in Switzerland is kind of the limit that anybody can bear spending X amount of billions on a project. And if we want to find out any more, tough, it's just too expensive. So we've reached a limit in terms of cost for some projects. So there's a move away from kind of single projects, single source, kind of the genius professor at the top in control of that knowledge, towards a kind of collaborative science or citizen science. Again, lots of synonyms or acronyms for kind of similar, not exactly the same, but kind of a move away from very few people in charge of an experiment to hundreds or thousands of people involved. In the UK, there are several kind of citizen science projects that have hundreds of thousands of people involved. There's globally now, there's a few research projects that have 10 million people involved, obviously working digitally or across electronic networks. So on projects that have almost never been done on that scale before, when NASA put a man or several men on the moon, they worked out that 100,000 people was the maximum you could possibly manage. After that, it just becomes unmanageable. So in terms of using traditional systems, 100,000 people was the limit. Whereas now we're using different kind of platforms, kind of digital platforms effectively. We can now work on the tens of millions. And we're just right at the kind of verge of kind of fathoming out what we can do with that kind of knowledge. But one of the kind of issues of that is as you move away from kind of centralized, controlled versions of knowledge, there's more multiplicity. There's more views of knowledge, more people in control of knowledge. Through digital kind of self-publishing, that knowledge can be disseminated by more and more people. So it's definitely kind of less certain and more, the CEO of Google calls it the largest experiment involving anarchy in history, this new production of knowledge. And the notion, I guess, is that anyone can be a researcher, or all of us are researchers. We're all producing knowledge, not necessarily in a kind of distinct way in the way that a kind of physicist might do, but we're all producing new forms of knowledge, new interpretations of what cities should be, how we might live, etc. Coming kind of to the end then. So in a way, it chimes with some of the projects that are already happening in terms of working with communities, maybe at a smaller scale or a neighborhood scale. But we're kind of on the verge of building or accessing or being able to access data or work across on a kind of global scale or much, much bigger projects or bigger scales that have never previously been done before. And also kind of funding through that, through crowdsourcing, methods of funding of projects that could never have been done before in a kind of localized way. Even the terms, the kind of collective nouns of clouds, assemblages, networks, kind of captures kind of messy, fluxy, very loose assemblage of different people in a way of working. And it produces a new political space in terms of kind of an intellectual space, in terms of where we can work, and also through that, or as a result of that, new physical kind of spaces that reflect the new politics that are emerging. I'll just finish on this slide, which it's described an actor network diagram. It's by Doina Petrescu's office again. I think it nicely captures the notion of trying to understand something at the kind of material scale as a human, the scale at which a human experience is part of a city. And then these networks and how they work with different agencies, some financial, some political, some organizational, some digital, some virtual. We're just trying to, at the moment, just trying to begin to understand the potential of what this means. Not kind of coming to a conclusion with this, but it's really at the beginning of what this might mean as over 1 billion people now are building their own cities globally, how we might intervene in that. I've got a kind of conclusion for that. But I'll stop there. Thank you.